If any of you guys watching this have been to or live in Northern California like me, we can all agree that there really is a lack of scary spots or paranormal activity in general. The Winchester Mystery House is still standing, but it's essentially transitioned into a tourist trap. It has tour guides and a gift shop now. Really takes the scare factor out of it. There are plenty of high crime or sketchy areas around here, but what I'm about to talk about is something completely different. What my friends and I encountered that night is something that still haunts me to this day. It was the middle of spring break that year, and my friends and I were bored out of our minds. Our flight to Miami got canceled last minute, and we knew we were going to be at home for a bit longer. We were a bunch of bored teenagers longing for an adventure. We knew that we were bound to make a series of stupid decisions after this, but hey, we were young. It's what you do. Eventually, I was scrolling through TikTok, and I came across a pretty viral video on my For You page. The TikTok was part of a series on paranormal places and legends across America, and this legend was apparently based in San Jose, California, the closest major city to us. The TikTok described a tale of a tribe, if you will, of albino ghost-like people who come out at night and prey on unsuspecting travelers. They were known to perform various satanic activities and rituals. Some even blamed them for the mysterious disappearances of people on those mountains they reside in. Legend says that the blood albinos who lived there were cursed or were demonic beings from another plane of existence. Other online articles talked about a set of screaming ghost-like creatures who would sweep people away in weird ways. Many other people online even mentioned hearing loud, shrill shrieking noises every time they drove by there after sunset. I even found a news article from a rather credible news site mentioning the disappearance of a young man in those same hills. The man was a young, healthy hiker and had seemingly no reason to disappear like that. The police still haven't found his body to this day. But after doing a bit more research online on blood albinos, I came to the conclusion that it was probably some sort of weird cult or drug group up in the hills. I assumed the hiker's disappearance could have just been a plain coincidence. Urban legends are very easy to spread online, so I brushed it off as another dumb myth. I brought it up to 3 of my friends and we laughed it off. All of us were skeptical of the fact that there are so-called blood albinos, and we thought it was another stupid online myth. Most of my friends, including myself, were never into paranormal activity. We never even believed in ghosts in the first place, so it was quite interesting that we were even talking about this in the first place. But my friends and I were eager for an adventure. We were bored out of our minds, and we were all blown away by how close this legend was to us. The so-called cursed mountains were only about 10 minutes away. We had way too much time on our hands, and we wanted to check out what was up there. We wanted to be the ones that would prove that there were no such blood albinos up there, and this was just a normal hill. If all else failed, then at least my friends and I would find ourselves a good smoke spot up there. The area seemed extremely remote, and we knew that no cop would be up there. Figuring we had nothing better to do, we set off at around 2 a.m. Coming with me were my friends Taylor, Kevin, and Jaime in the driver's seat. The things we brought with us included flashlights, phone chargers, and a few recreational drugs of our choice. We set our GPS to Hicks Road, San Jose, California, and we drove off. As we started driving up the hills, everything seemed pretty normal. The twisty mountain roads were nothing too atypical, and we seemed to be going past a water reservoir. At this point, we let our guard down completely. We even started cracking jokes on how stupid this idea was and how people are afraid of everything. As we drove deeper into the hills, Kevin said that he found a Google Maps link on a forum. The link would guide you to a set of coordinates where supposedly the blood albinos were. We decided to say hell with it and go over to the coordinates. Every part of me told me that this was a horrible idea, but hell, my judgment was horrible at the time. But as we got there, things started to get legitimately eerie. There was no cell phone signal, and we were out in the woods at 3 a.m. If we screamed or cried for help, no one would hear us. Despite our gut feelings, we kept driving. As we reached the house, there was an extended driveway that stemmed from the main road. There were no house numbers, no street lights, and no blood albinos either. As disappointed as we were still eager to explore the houses. We all got out of the car. Kevin and Taylor pulled out a joint, while Jaime and I went over to explore the house ourselves. As Jaime and I ventured throughout the houses, we didn't see anything too out of the ordinary. Graffiti, litter, and booze bottles were among the things we found there. Nothing too atypical for an old house. There was a star of Satan painted on the ground, but we didn't think much of it. Anyone could have put that there, especially a bored group of teenagers like us. There were a few more old sheds and structures, but again, it wasn't anything unusual. It was an ordinary abandoned neighborhood, unoccupied for a long, long amount of time. But as Jaime and I explored the back of the house, we noticed a path. But it wasn't a paved path. It was a path formed from years of people walking up and down there. Someone had been coming up there. Naturally, Jaime and I decided to explore the path. As we went down there, we heard a loud, ghastly yell. It sounded like a person, but it wasn't at the same time. The shrieks were almost controlled, almost like they were talking to someone. Whoever was making this noise sounded angry, almost territorial. We shined our flashlight roughly where the sound came from. We noticed a deer lying dead on the ground. It was dismembered and mutilated. At first, Jaime and I passed it off as a mountain lion attack. There are a lot of pumas in the hills, but the shrieks didn't sound like a deer or a mountain lion at all. And considering mountain lions drag their prey away, it made no sense why a mutilated deer was lying there. It just didn't add up. But as we looked up and around, Jaime and I froze. In the distance, not too far away from the deer, was a shadowy figure. We could barely make it out in the darkness, but as a reflex, I shined my flashlight at the figure. I thought it was Kevin trying to prank me. But as the light reflected, we realized the humanoid figure wasn't Kevin. It seemed to be some sort of creature that stood up on two legs. Something about it seemed human and not human at the same time. It had paper white pasty skin, and its eyes seemed to be a bloodshot red. I wanted to believe it was some crazy homeless person or crackhead in the woods, but the way this thing moved, it wasn't human. It was unlike anything we'd ever seen before. And that's when the creature leaped. It hopped over to the deer, and suddenly 3 more pasty white creatures stepped out and swooped the deer away. 3 of them quickly swooped the deer carcass away into the darkness, but to our horror, one of the 4 just stood there and looked at us. Jaime and I were shaking. I consider myself normally a calm person, but my adrenaline was pumping. The creature shrieked and took a step forward. Jaime and I ran as fast as we could. We sprinted knowing that our lives may depend on it. I didn't even think of looking back. The shrieking got louder and louder, and we heard more and more footsteps following us. We came across Kevin and Taylor, and they seemed really confused. "Start the car and get us out of here," I yelled. Both of them were confused, but when they saw the look on Jaime and I's face, they knew there was no time for questions. We jumped in the car. Kevin quickly started it and stepped on the gas. As we were pulling out, we heard more shrieks coming up behind us. Taylor started to cry. As we were leaving the windy dirt road, one of the creatures came up unexpectedly from the side and lunged into the car. Kevin didn't even have time to react. The creature struck the side front bumper. None of us even wanted to think about turning back and seeing what we struck, but I managed to look through the rear window and saw it. The albino was completely unfazed. Didn't seem to be hurt by the moving car. It just stared at us menacingly as we drove away. When we got back to the main city, we explained to Kevin and Taylor what exactly happened. We debated calling the police, but we knew that for 1, we would be incriminating ourselves for the drugs in our car, and 2, the police would never believe us. The car had a massive dent in the front bumper from the collision. Unfortunately, a big dent in the front bumper isn't enough to prove the existence of blood albinos. We rarely have talked about this. Jaime and I have mentioned it once or twice briefly, but we would both immediately stop talking about it. Kevin and Taylor were skeptical at first, but when they saw how frightened I was, they took our word for it. Let this be a message to anyone who wants to visit the Hicks Road in San Jose. Bring a friend, and go at daytime. You do not want to meet whoever we encountered there.
This incident occurred sometime in the fall of 2006. I grew up in a rural part of Ohio. My house had fairly dense woods located directly behind it. As a child, I had a passion for exploring. I especially loved exploring those woods. It was my favorite place to be. Prior to this incident, I had wandered through those woods many times, always with my mother's permission. There was one tree in particular that I frequently enjoyed to climb, usually about to the halfway mark so I could perch myself on one of the heavier branches and just relax as I listened to the peaceful sounds of nature. Climbing that tree for the very first time was quite an accomplishment. From that position, I could partially see the back of my house. On that day, after a fair amount of exploring, I carefully scaled my favorite tree. I seated myself on a sturdy branch and took in the view. Naturally, being late in October, the sun inevitably began to set within a few minutes. I always felt a little saddened to see the darkness approaching. The woods were like my own little sanctuary. I could entertain myself out there for hours. When darkness began to fall, however, my mother would stand at the edge of the woods and call my name until I obediently returned home, so not to be stranded out there after dark. After watching the sun set until I could no longer see it, I began my descent down the tree. I was nearly at the bottom when I heard my mother's familiar voice calling my name. I thought nothing of it at first, as this routine had occurred plenty of times before. Then I realized something strange as my feet touched the ground. My mother's voice was coming from behind me, deeper in the woods, rather than towards the entrance where she always stood when she called me home. My mom had never entered those woods before, at least not with me. I was eager to find her and show her all of my favorite spots before it grew too dark. That's when I realized something was off. How could she have gone into those woods ahead of me? Certainly I could have missed her, but as I said, she never entered those woods. She continued calling my name, but there was something strange about it. She sounded absolutely frantic, almost angry. Fearing that I was in trouble for reasons currently unknown, I froze in place. As her voice drew closer, I squinted my eyes to see if I could locate her and determine exactly how angry or upset she appeared to be. However, I didn't see anyone or anything unusual. Suddenly I heard her voice calling my name from the direction of my house, sounding much calmer. Seconds later, from somewhere within the woods yet again, it wasn't an echo. I wasn't imagining things. I was literally hearing her beckoning me from the edge of our backyard, as well as ahead of me. My legs suddenly turned to jelly. I couldn't quite comprehend what was going on. "Come here, right now," the voice that I originally believed to be hers screamed from just ahead. I realized that whoever or whatever was mimicking my mother was drawing closer. I didn't question which voice was actually my mother's, as there was something about the way it sounded that unnerved me. Terrified of what I would see if I stood there much longer, I turned around and ran towards the exit of the woods as quickly as my legs could possibly carry me. It was amazing that I didn't trip over anything in my haste. Even though my house wasn't very far away from me from where I was standing, those woods had never seemed larger to me than they did in that moment. From behind me, my mother's voice continued to call my name, now sounding desperate. Panic set in as my actual mother finally came into view, waiting patiently as she usually did until I returned home. In my frightened state, I absolutely refused to look back. As soon as I was out of the woods and in the backyard next to my mother, the other voice was suddenly gone. Rather than fading away, it seemed to stop the very moment I stepped foot into my backyard. I must have looked as frightened as I felt because my mother asked me what was wrong. Slowly but surely, my panic subsided. I didn't say anything until we were safely inside the house with our doors locked. I asked my mother if she had entered the woods. Appearing confused by the question, she told me that of course she didn't. With that confirmation, I hesitantly asked her if she had heard anyone else calling my name and yelling. The answer to that question was also no. Although I was still very much shaken up, I managed to explain everything that happened as clearly and rationally as possible. My mother was surprisingly nonchalant about the whole situation, explaining that I must have imagined it, that I was spending too much time out there by myself. The incident in those woods had stayed with me to this day. I can still hear this voice as clear as a bell. Whoever or whatever is calling my name sounded exactly like my mother, but I know it wasn't her. Not only was she waiting for me outside, but the voice also sounded strange in a way that I still can't fully explain. I didn't go back into the woods until I was 17 years old, and even then, I never hung out for very long. I've carefully gone over every possible explanation, but none of them seemed entirely plausible. It certainly wasn't my mother playing a prank. There was no way she could have pulled it off, not to mention the fact that she's never been one to play pranks. I also highly doubt that it was anyone else because, as I stated before, we lived in a very rural area. The closest neighbor was at least a mile away, and I wasn't personally acquainted with any of them. How could they have known my name and where to find me? We've since moved out of that house, but my mother and I occasionally discuss the incident. She still claims that she never heard or saw anything unusual out there. I know it probably shouldn't, but what happened in those woods continues to bother me. I spent many hours out there prior to that day and never had anything out of the ordinary occur. The best explanation I have at this point is a doppelganger or possibly a demon, but I'm unsure. If anyone has a possible explanation as to what might have happened, I'd love to hear it. I'm a 23-year-old female. Used to not believe in ghosts at all. I'm a psychology student and used to think that everything can be chalked up to someone's own anxieties and fears. That was until last year. This happened in Colorado Springs on Gold Camp Road. If anyone knows what I'm talking about, you know that this place is a hotspot for urban legends and creepy ghost stories. The road is located on the side of a mountain and has several large tunnels dug through the mountain that you have to drive through to get to the end of the road. It's mostly used to get to scenic routes that overlook the city and hiking trails. There are also all sorts of scary stories that I'm sure you've heard of if you grew up in the area. The story goes that a bus full of small children crashed within one of the tunnels after it partially collapsed, and the spirits of those children are trapped in the tunnel. Supposedly, if you drive in the tunnel at night and come to a stop, turn your lights out, and put baby powder or flour on your windshield, little ghost hands will smear the powder all around. Also, I'm not sure if this story has any validity to it, but I've been told a lot of people dump bodies over the side of the road. The cliffs and heavy wilderness apparently make it a good place to hide evidence. Anyway, this was all nonsense to me. I would drive the Gold Camp Road about once a week during the summer, as it was a beautiful night drive to take with friends, and there are several pullover spots to smoke with relative certainty that you will not encounter any police. Now, I won't be offended if you think that the fact that I was a little out of it may have contributed to what I saw. Anything's possible. Anyway, my friend, a 21-year-old female, and I spent about an hour one night smoking, walking around the scenic spots, playing music until about 3 or 4 a.m. Again, we had been doing this exact routine all summer and were used to the dark, creepy tunnels and the heavy woods at night. And this particular night was no different. That was until we started ascending to the peak. I'm not sure how to describe the feeling of getting to a certain point on the mountain, but it felt like a distinct passing over. There was a specific moment I remember feeling that we were in a completely different location. It was kind of like the moment in Spirited Away when all the spirits come out at night in the city in the beginning. It was like nothing was there and we were all alone, and suddenly it just felt extremely populated. We couldn't see anything and it was still dark, but it was like there was an energy all around us. It was like the sensation of being in a loud crowd without anything physical happening. I started to feel really uneasy and my friend told me she was getting a little creeped out. I told her it was okay. We were almost to the second tunnel and then we would descend. We entered the tunnel and the headlights lit up everything to the end. That's when I saw it. A very distinct, clear as day little boy was just standing to the right of the tunnel, almost touching the wall. He didn't look exactly like a real boy that would be standing there. Instead, like an overexposed film photograph of a little boy. My friend and I both gasped, and I slammed the brakes dramatically. And then, just like that, it was gone. Now, I don't mean he disappeared. I mean we realized he was never there. You know that shock you get when you wake up in a dark room and you see a jacket hanging on the door, and for a split second are convinced someone is standing there, but as soon as your eyes adjust, you realize there was never anything there at all. It was like that, but there was nothing that we could have mistaken for any type of figure. The tunnel was lit up by headlights, and there was no rock formation or pattern in the wall or anything, just smooth rock wall and the bright light of my headlights. I have never seen anything like it. What convinced me is that my friend saw it too, and neither of us had the stereotypical reaction of mistaking something for a ghost, like just jumping or feeling a shiver. I slammed my brakes because I was positive there was a child, and then suddenly, there never was. It's the most bizarre experience I have ever had. I will never doubt the existence of the paranormal ever again. All I can say is, don't always discount urban legends. They have a funny way of reaching out to you. I have worked at 4 different hotels. One of my owners once told me that any hotel over 10 years old will have had deaths in it. The only hotels that don't are because they are brand new. So I started asking the others on my call-arounds. Every hotel in my area had at least 1 death in the past 3 years, if not more. If it's had deaths, then 100% are haunted, and 100% of older hotels are guaranteed to be haunted. In my 6 years, I worked shift for 2 deaths at different hotels. 1 natural, 1 worse. My ex worked at a hotel with 1 room that was never rented and used as storage because it was the site of a well-known serial killer double homicide back in the 60s. Deaths in hotels are not rare. I do not subscribe to the death equals haunted formula. Of my hotels, only 1 acted haunted in my time there. I was strictly night shift, sometimes 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., sometimes 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. At 11 p.m. I would get to lock all the doors and deal with people through a night window. I love this, as I generally dislike people, but I am good at acting the part of wonderful customer service employee. Hospitality is my middle name, but after 11 p.m. I got to close off my domain of lobby/office, front desk, and breakfast room all combined and be left alone till breakfast. So I think that's all the setup I need for you to know about my private little kingdom under lock and key where all this takes place during my solo hours. A few weeks into my job, I was scrolling on my phone and bam, the breakfast room doors thundered, then rattled to a stop like they'd been kicked by a mule. I glanced at my security camera, which focuses on those doors. Nothing there. I rewind a few seconds. Nothing, so I go a bit further. Still nothing. A full minute back and rewatch it till the moment I see myself jump on office cam. Nothing. The doors don't even move. But I've heard kids slam those double French doors. That's what they sound like. That's where the noise came from. I walked around the office, lobby, and breakfast room, peering out the windows because maybe I'd heard a car wreck. Nothing. I check my bucket. Nobody is in the room above my office or breakfast rooms. These are often the ones we sell last at the morning activity, or me playing music for myself at night, and it sometimes disturbs people. This exploding door kick becomes a theme, but it's not just the breakfast room doors. It's the lobby doors that I can clearly see out from my perch behind the counter. Even more unnerving, the private office entrance door that is unlabeled and only employees use to enter the back of the front desk becomes a target for these sporadic, unseen kicks. I keep a FD journal of anything that happens during our shift, anything that might be an issue for other shifts, complaints, special requests, anything out of the norm. I start noting the sounds in the journal and ask my coworkers if they've noticed any strange noises. Nobody else has, even the other night shift workers, but they did have a high turnover rate. Other than the front desk manager and housekeepers, within 6 months, I was the next longest employee. Other night shifters never lasted than 3 months, and I worked every Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, so they always got weekends off work always, but never stayed long. Next, the ice machine started coming on and just spitting ice out onto the breakfast room floor. This was less common than the booming doors, but it happened a handful of times in my 2 years there. It never happened on anyone else's shift as far as I could find out. The owners just said it was a machine malfunction and mostly ignored me, telling me just to clean it up when it happened and reminded me to put out a wet floor caution sign if it was near breakfast time. Yet the owners were Indian, and after this started showing up at dawn and blessing my kingdom more often. After that was the clicking. If you've ever heard a dog that needs its nails trimmed trotting across a hardwood floor, that's the noise. At first I was on the lookout for a big rat or other critter, but security cameras and my vigilant search armed with a broom yielded nothing. I still told the owners to call pest control to be safe, but they found no evidence of a furry friend, caught nothing, and bait traps were left untouched. This became a routine sound too. Near the end of my time there, I was on my phone with a friend one night on the far back of my office, away from the desk in the L part where my industrial coffee makers are, and a small whiteboard we used to track daily numbers flew off the wall and smacked me almost square in the face, then dropped to the floor at my feet. It was odd because it's fallen before and it ends up straight down on what we call the load desk, where the manager works during the day. I was several steps away, say roughly 8 feet from that desk. There was no breeze to make it travel at an angle, and even if it had, it was mounted just barely above face level for me. It had to travel nearly straight sideways to smack me in the mug. I laughed it off, but I really kicked myself for not using my camera and getting a recording of the security footage at the time. It's the strongest evidence I've ever had of any of my paranormal events, and I just derped out. I guess I did have bigger issues in my life at the time that I was talking to a friend about, but boy was I dumb. Feel free to tell me how dumb I was. If it speaks to how distracted I was during that time in my life, that was when I worked straight through a death one empty room away from my office and didn't even notice.